He's like, I'm done. That's neat. All right, we'll get rolling. I realized that I probably should have had Kit send out a reminder that we were having adult ed on Sunday, but whatever. Thank you, Mike. Okie dokie. So we're, I don't know if you remember, but 3 weeks ago now, I left you with homework. But not really. What's that? The dog ate it. The dog ate it, yeah. Let's talk real quick about the fall and what do we want to do. So we're at the point now, well, as a reminder, we were talking about Barnabas and Saul. When we finish with these two guys, this pretty much wraps up who we can track through the book of Acts. Because we already did, Peter. We already did Philip. We're doing Barnabas and Paul. We get kind of incidental mentions of some of the other disciples in Acts, but nothing really in depth. And so if you look up kind of information on the rest of these guys, essentially all you've got left are like Wikipedia entries, right? Meaning that these are the folks that we have the most detailed information about. So what this means is, in terms of what's left in this class, in this specific topic, tracking the apostles, where we go next is basically a couple paragraphs per apostle, okay? Because we just don't have anything. We have conjecture, right? So we talked in the beginning about how, Thomas is purported to have gone to Southeast Asia, potentially maybe made it as far as India at some point. We know that James, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, James is martyred rather early. He gets killed. But the rest of them, we just don't have a whole lot, right? And so it's like we've got historical traditions of how historical they are versus how traditional they are. So long story short, we maybe only got, after we wrap up Barnabas and Paul, we've maybe only got another couple of weeks worth of stuff to talk about. And basically what that's going to be is, just kind of like, here's what happened to Thomas, here's what happened to Levi, that kind of stuff. We have an option, and we had talked about it, which is we could pivot then into talking more about what goes on in that kind of like 2nd century common era, right? So what happens between the end of the 12 and not quite to Constantine, but kind of the early formation of the church. What does that look like? We could do that. We could also bookmark that, and say we're going to do that, but we're going to take a break, come back to it, right? And do something different for the fall. Got options. I'm good either way. I'm good either way. If we wanted to bookmark the early church stuff, the question would be, what do we want to do in the interim? The things that I do want to line up and will line up is, at some point this fall, Brandy Johnson from Love One is going to come in and present and talk about what Love One does. At some point, we'll probably have, well, depending on how things go with our Cascadia Partners conversation, we may have somebody from Cascadia Partners coming in to talk to the congregation, which would probably happen during this time slot. So we've got a couple of one-offs that we can do in there, but the question would be, do we go back and do a book of the Bible, right? We've been kind of doing the book of the Bible. We've been doing Acts. So think about that. But I'm just kind of giving you the 2-week notes, right? Like, believe it or not, we're rather close to wrapping up the story of the apostles as much as we have. So think about where you want to head next. The early church stuff, I will say, would require me to do a bit of research, which isn't unreasonable to have that done in a couple of weeks. So, math. That might be interesting. Do you want to do do we want to do a study of Gnosticism? Yeah. Well, sorry, I'm not being facetious. That legitimately would be interesting because, I mean, the story of the early church is essentially the story of them figuring out what they believe, right? I mean, this is, yeah, we talk about the many heresies. It sounds, when we use the word heresy, the first thing that comes to mind is like the Spanish Inquisition and torture racks and burning at the stake. That wasn't quite what it looked like in 2nd century Christianity, but almost. But there was. But what's interesting about it is you're essentially looking at like the Darwinian process of the evolution of Christianity, and as with all things that evolve, some things have to. There are aberrant evolutionary paths that don't survive, and yeah, many of the early heresies are those exactly. The Marcionites, the Marian controversy. I mean, all of that Gnostic stuff is really fascinating because a lot of it has to do with basically who is Jesus. What is Jesus?
There's a Gnostic church in South.
Well, Gnosticism is a philosophy that actually, intersects with every group.
Yeah. Gnostic is not knowledge. Gnosos, right? Yeah. When we say, when I say Gnosticism, what I mean by that, or what I'm referring to, is a lot of those early quote unquote heresies came out of this idea that a branch of what was becoming Christianity had special knowledge, and Gnosticism characterized a lot of those early quote unquote heresies in terms of like even the idea that like you had to have special knowledge about God in order to be in the in crowd of God, right? And that manifested in different ways. Like some of is it the Marian controversy where he only wanted the three out of the 4 gospels, and or is that Marcionites? Marcion, one of these early guys. He went through the Bible with a fine-tooth comb, and he decided that the only valuable stuff was the Synoptic Gospels. John didn't line up for him, and I think a couple of the Pauline epistles, not all of them, and just get rid of the Old Testament completely because it was not valuable. And that was what he felt, what it meant to follow Jesus. Now, obviously, that was an evolutionary track of Christianity that did not survive. I don't think Marcion did either. I don't remember actually.
Gnosticism is very, very important for us to understand because it undergirds a lot of epistemology. It's how do you know anything?
How do you know what you know?
How do you know what you know? And the Gnostic claim is that there are secrets that are in the middle, right? And
Dan Brown is making millions off of Gnosticism.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know how much. I'm sure.
Great conspiracy theory.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, I mean that's a lot. I mean, in a twisted track, that's what a lot of modern, quote unquote, conspiracy stuff is.
Sure.
And unfortunately, it's a lot what a lot of a significant vocal minority of our country thinks is going on. Is that there's secret societies that have secret knowledge and
The whole history of the Masonic
Yeah.
is not
which is cool. So I I listened to a podcast talking about the origins of the Masons, right? And they were legitimately just a guild of Masons. That's how it started, right? Yeah, way in Bavaria, right? So, anyways, Illuminati, the same thing. Yeah. Anyway, continue, Paul.
Well, just to say, if
Epistemology.
you draw a bunch of concentric circles up there,
Yeah.
Okay, so Gnosticism says there's this center, right, of reality. It's mysterious and somehow only a few chosen folks know what's going on.
Yeah.
And then there's a few people around them, that they've got some idea of it. And then there's another group around that well, they haven't been enlightened at all yet. So they're outside the pale. And so what you have is, good target. And that's Gnosticism.
Yep.
And everybody who has a truth claim says, we're in the middle, we're in that middle circle. And the rest of you guys just haven't caught on yet.
Yeah.
And so we don't have to listen to you because you don't really count, because you don't really know what's going on.
Yeah.
And it is a mystery, and again, only a few of us have been initiated into the mystery.
Yeah.
And so the church has done this also.
Yeah.
And I would just,
Yeah, please.
What does it mean to be an apostle?
Yeah.
Okay, because the claim to be being the apostolic church is a Gnostic sort of claim. I'm not saying it's absolutely false. I'm just saying that if you look at just the book of Acts and ask, well, we started out with Jesus, and then Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Right?
Yeah.
Those were our big start. And then you just went to Barnabas and Paul because that's where Acts goes, right?
Yeah.
So so you get Peter, Andrew, James, and John. What about the other eight? Well, they're not sort of in the interior of the inside of it. And then who does Jesus love the most? And then so there's John in there,
The
right?
beloved disciple.
Right, like the beloved disciple.
The other John.
And then you get, after that, okay, we've got Barnabas and Paul, and then you get all kinds of other people, Lydia and Titus, and all these kind of folks, right, that are in there. And but they're kind of on the outside. So what does it mean to be an apostle? And all we get in the book of Acts is a very simple thing. The apostles are the folks who walked with Jesus when he was around, and they saw him after the resurrection. Because they have the eyewitness account of the resurrection and the ascension. So resurrection and ascension are they're the witnesses. They are the eyewitnesses to that. That's all they are. There aren't any apostles after they die.
No.
But there is a thought about apostolic succession. In other words, we have the authority from these guys.
We have good information.
Right. We have that middle of the target
Yeah.
track. We have a direct line to that.
Yeah.
Okay. But then we built up through, again, the history of apostolic succession is important because these are the claims to what is authentically tied to Jesus, right?
Yeah.
And so you have a tradition that goes that the Orthodox now trace back, right,
Yeah.
to their apostolic claim. There is the tradition of the Roman Church, which says we're the apostolic succession, right?
Yeah.
There's a tradition of the Coptic Church in Egypt and North Africa that says we have that direct line. So this idea of how does the book of Acts go on? I mean, it ends very quickly, right? Paul's in Rome.
Yeah.
But how does it go on? What is Jesus doing through his authorities, his apostles, if you will? But when all the apostles are his eyewitnesses who die out, the claim to them is the critical claim to what has authoritative power. Yeah?
And this is the transition point, which is, again, the early apostles are the ones that saw it happen. Right? So if you think about that, it's what legitimizes their authority is being able to, from their memory, say, this is who Jesus is. Okay, every degree of separation that you get from that, you get further detached from that concrete connection. 2,000 years of separation from it, right? And so what we do as denominations and different versions of Christianity is some of us draw a line, literally, back to those original 12. And we say, well, literally and metaphorically, we have handed on that story and those traditions from person to person to person to person. And what legitimizes our authority is the ability to draw that line back, right? So for Catholics, we can draw the popes all the way back to Peter. For the Episcopalians, similar thing. But and for us Lutherans, we took this slight left turn with Luther. But Luther felt that what he was actually doing, which so many reformers do, is returning back to an original iteration of Christianity, which is closer to that original source. Which you still hear, we still use this language in today, right? Like, let's return to something that's closer to Jesus. Which you will hear a lot of people who would not identify as faithful people say things like, well, I celebrate the teachings of Jesus, but don't necessarily identify as a Christian, which is in a way saying, well, I think at some point the institution that called itself the church, the body of Christ, diverged too far from the projection, the trajectory of what Christianity should look like. But this is what we all do. Every single church and denomination is making a claim that we have knowledge of God that is more accurate than our brothers or sisters. Sort of. I mean, it's a little bit.
I think not sort of.
Yeah.
The reason I say that is that so I think Gnosticism underlies the American individualism that we are buried by today. And the claim throughout people even reading Acts is that, there is an authoritative community, not an authoritative individual.
Yeah.
It's like the names of superstars, celebrity Christians like Paul, just fade out. They fade. Why do they fade? Because this is really the book of the acts of Jesus through his eyewitnesses. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Right? And the whole thing for Paul is that he was an eyewitness via, right, the Damascus Road experience. Right?
Yep.
In other words, he has nothing aside from that experience.
His literal come to Jesus experience.
Literal. Right. So, you say make perfect the straight path of the Lord. Yeah, thanks for putting that out there, because that's what apostleship is about.
Yeah.
Right. This is the straight path, and all you guys are
On the crooked path.
on the crooked path. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I would maintain that today the issue really is, as the Roman Church has said, it's about ecclesiology. It is about what community of people, not what individual, but what communities of people best exemplify, and not just the teachings of Jesus, but the Holy Spirit of Jesus in the community.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So that's why we keep getting new communities.
Yeah.
There's a new one that's going now, and it uses the word apostle. And it's a big right-wing thing that's going on. Big right-wing movement.
I'm not tied in enough to.
Oh yeah. That's what you can check it out.
Yeah.
It has apostolic in it, but what it is it's all these non-denominational churches are now coalescing in the background. Are they part of this apostolic movement that includes basically that Trump is as close to it as I am. No, sure. That there is no more clear person around it, but there are many conservative groups that are just sucked into it.
It's called the Apostolic Reformation.
Yeah, New Apostolic Reformation, and it's not a denomination. No, we're not another denomination. We're a movement of the Spirit. Well, what the heck is any denomination?
Yeah,
Oh, okay, so apostolicity is very much a question in 2023 is what I'm saying, okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and the reason I wrote this up here was for two reasons. One is it directly relates to what we're talking about. It's a good segue. But the other is this was actually your homework 3 weeks ago. If you don't recall, was to dwell on what that means. So to put it in context, it draws back again 3 weeks ago. We're in Acts 13, and Barnabas and Saul get commissioned. They get sent out, and they end up going to Cyprus. Do you remember talking about this? And they get to Cyprus, and there's a guy there who is the he's a consultant to the proconsul, and he's a self-described magician / prophet named Bar Jesus, which is spelled like this.
Son of Joshua.
Yeah, son of Joshua. Bar, son of. And he has the ear of the proconsul and is basically claiming to have Gnostic knowledge, right? Special knowledge. He's not, despite this name, he's probably not part of the Christian movement. Okay, the text identifies him as a Jewish false prophet, but again, the reason that Paul also spoke up and said son of Joshua is Yeshua, which is Jesus, is also Joshua, right? They're essentially the same name. Okay? So we translate it as Bar Jesus. You could just as well translate it as Bar Joshua. Okay? So he's claiming prophetic knowledge, and he's using that supposed prophetic knowledge to have influence and power in the land in which he lives.
His other name is Elvis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which let's just unpack that real quick. So I'm going to repeat this to you. So this is a person who is claiming to have special knowledge about God, and because he has that quote unquote special knowledge about God, he believes, or he's using that as authority to have temporal authority to influence the politicians of the day. Sound familiar? Okay. And for me personally, there is so much that is fundamentally wrong with that, whether or not this guy is saying good stuff. Just this idea that being a person with secret knowledge of God qualifies you to make governing decisions is anathema. Okay? And that might sound strange because, we as people of faith would wholeheartedly claim that our faith should and would have influence and inform potentially our political choices as well, too, right? But what this guy is doing is kind of the exact opposite of that, which is he is not interested in informing people about the divine. He is interested in utilizing this idea that he's got special knowledge in order to build his own power and influence. Which my bias, Paul too has a bias. When I look at individuals or groups of people who start things called the New Apostolic Reform or whatever, with the intent of supporting a specific political candidate, this is what I immediately assume they're doing. Okay, because I would hope that if your faith influences you, informs you, and says, because of your faith, this is what you think our country should be doing, you would by default understand that you cannot tie that to any one specific candidate or I would even say political ideology, right? In other words, you're listening first to the voice of the divine, and secondly, to your political movement. And I would say one of the characteristics that says that you're actually attempting to listen to put the voice of the divine first is that you are able to critique your own political ideology from a place of faith. In other words, you are able to point out all of the no's, all of the ways in which your political ideology does not and cannot align with the kingdom of God. If you're incapable of doing that, you're in fact doing the reverse, which is you're taking your cultural, contextual identity, your worldview that you were raised with, and you're projecting it back onto God. And you're saying, I want these two things to line up because it makes me feel good about my assumption. I don't know if that's what he's doing. But the important part, well, there's a lot more, but what happens in the story here is that Paul and Barnabas come into this situation, presumably seeking to do what they do, which is to evangelize, to spread the good news of Jesus, who Paul, we know, has physically encountered. Well, no, hashtag asterisk, he's witnessing to the gospel. And if this guy is legit, listening to the voice of the divine, there should be room for cross-pollination here. But there isn't, because what this guy sees is two other guys trying to edge in on his scheme, okay? Which prompts this line, Paul's rebuke of Bar Jesus, which is, I paraphrase a little bit there, but he says, "You son of the devil, you enemy of all righteousness, full of all deceit and villainy, will you not stop making crooked the straight path of the Lord?" And so, I left you with 3 weeks ago was I asked you to kind of think about what that meant when Paul said it, but we place this in a modern, in our world. Do we see this? Where do we see this? What does this look like? This ties in really well with what we were talking about earlier, talking about Gnosticism, secret knowledge, because there's a really permeable barrier. There's a really fuzzy line between claiming, which we all do, we have to, that's what the nature of religion is. We make claims on the divine. We say, this is who God is, this is what God is about, based off of my reading of Scripture, based off of my direct experience of the divine, right? And again, this is where apostolic succession comes in, is that we've got people saying, well, I physically walked with Jesus. We can trace that back. Okay? There's a fine line between making claims on God and making claims on God, which is turning God into who we want God to be because it's more compatible with me, right? And when we do that, right, when we make God look more like us, we make God look less like other people, right? So we make a claim on the divine, we claim secret knowledge about God, which restricts access to the divine. In other words, it makes crooked the straight path of the Lord. Because if what Paul and Barnabas are doing is proclaiming the good news of the resurrected Lord Jesus Christ and blah, 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 which we do get a bit of a summary of following this. What they're trying to do, theoretically, is provide access to Christ. Okay? And yet, from a modern perspective, how much of what we hear is not about making broad the straight paths of the Lord, but claiming that we have a toll booth set up on the straight path of the Lord, right? That, in other words, we've got a security checkpoint on the road to the access of the divine, and only certain people are allowed to walk it, right? And here are the qualifications, which are shockingly often tied into our cultural and personal assumptions. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Paul, you were
Well,
itching.
only that they're personal, but they're always personal assumptions are based upon the group I belong to.
Yes. Oh yeah. Totally. Yeah.
And it's very much a communal thing, and some of the mysticism of Gnosticism gets lost in that. In other words, we get lost in the big group that we're in. Yeah? And then we quit assuming that there are other groups that are worth listening to, right? And so we just are in this echo chamber that we grew up in.
Yeah.
And for instance, those sitting here may have been, maybe our main tie to Jesus is our parents.
Yeah.
Or our youth group when we were a kid, or something like that, right? So it's never just me and Jesus.
No.
It's always me and the group that nurtured me.
Yeah. And Jesus.
That nurtured my worldview.
Yeah.
And that taught me a language.
Yeah.
That taught me how to be critical at all, right? If that was the interest of that group.
Yeah.
Right? The thing about our Jesus is the Elvis is a sorcerer, so it's always tied to him personally.
Yeah.
That is, if you want to be tight with the proconsul, which
Yeah.
is the senatorial Roman Senate representative in the area, right? That's huge.
Big
Political. Yeah, it's better than the
Capital B. Big deal.
Yeah, and so if you want to be tied to him, you
Got to go through him. Got to go through Bar Jesus.
Yeah, I'm the gatekeeper for that house.
Yeah.
And then you reverse that by going, oh, what we don't have an end to the political power, so now we have to do an end around to get to the political power.
Yeah.
And if we have to claim it's a lie for the election, that's what we'll do.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
We will access that political power, and then it will become authenticating for us.
Yeah.
In other words, Bar Jesus is, Elvis is not much of a guy on his own.
Yeah.
It's the tie to the pro-council.
Yeah.
If once you're in the White House, then you've got some power, right? You gotta get that White House.
Yeah.
Right. So, why? Because that authenticates your claim, whether or not the claim has any real merit or not. Just as, we need to be, I think, very humble about Christianity.
Yeah.
As a movement in the world.
Yeah.
And I guess I want to say that from these very, this is an extremely humble origin. And it is very easy for somebody to go, well, who's ever got the ear of the pro-council must be right.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Mike makes right.
Unfortunately, these days, the social media is.
That's Elvis right there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's a pact.
Yeah.
It's a distorted.
Right, that's, again, it's a crooked, it's a stake, right? So, who controls knowledge is what Gnosticism is about. Who controls the media is what Gnosticism is about. That's why it's not just a particular.
Well, I mean, yeah, and you all, believe it or not, experience Gnosticism on a daily basis.
Every day.
Every time you see a headline that says, here are the 5 secrets that doctors don't want you to know about X, Y, and Z. That's a Gnostic claim, right? And there's a reason. And there's a reason that you see those headlines. That's because it works. Because for whatever reason, human beings have hardwired into us this desire to have the right secret answer, right? To know something that other people don't, because it gives us power. It makes us the popular person in the room to talk with, like all these things, because, if we do it right, we gain literal power from it as well, too. So, like,
100 years ago, that's how the snake oil sellers.
oh, totally.
Well,
But
it's how you sell those things.
or whatever it is. But it's snake oil. But again, how does this stuff arise? It arises in an environment where ignorance exists, right? In other words, the only way that these things can thrive is in a world where the information is not there. And unfortunately, what we see so often nowadays is there is no longer such a thing as an elite or an expert opinion, right? All knowledge is questionable, right? This is kind of what social media has brought on. It's this idea that, and it's very simple. Well, it's very similar to what happened post-Reformation as well, too. It's like when you democratize access to big ideas, then that means anybody can claim to have big ideas, whether or not they actually are qualified to have those big ideas or not, right? So, rewind 3 years ago, and we're trying to figure out how to stop the onset of this pandemic. And at first, they said no masks because reasons, shortage of masks. They didn't want hospitals to run out of PPE and all this stuff. Maybe that was part of the decision-making process. I don't know. And then all of a sudden later on, well, absolutely, you need to wear masks, right? But in the meantime, you've got people who are saying, well, the masks make it harder to breathe. And I mean, you were there. I don't need to repeat all this stuff for you. But, this is nonsense. This is exactly what's going on, right? Which is dangerous when it involves a pandemic, but it's also extremely dangerous when it comes to our faith. And because when we rewind, go to the Gospels, the only times that you see Jesus get truly upset is when people are trying to restrict access to him, right? So do not prevent the little ones from coming to me. It'd be better that you tie a millstone around your neck and throw it into the sea, right? Or Matthew 19 or 25. Where were you when I was in prison? Where were you when I was sick? 25, right? Where were you when meaning, he's metaphorizing here. He's not talking about him. He is talking about him. But in other words, here are all these people that you have outcast in your society that, in other words, serving Jesus is about not excluding, okay? And if you exclude yourself, not them. Right? So the only time you see Jesus get upset is when people do this. I mean, he gets upset about other things too, but this is kind of the one that really ticks him off, okay? So this is why for me, Paul says something like, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, which Kierkegaard later picks up on and runs with, is it's not just about your salvation, right? It's when you work out your salvation to the exclusion, of others. Is when you try to tell other people, well, no. This is the path to Christ. But it's not really the path to Christ. It's the way you want. It's your path to Christ that you've worked out for yourself. And Paul is saying, better be careful about that. It's in today's news atmosphere. It's really easy to identify this stuff going on. We're not exempt from this critique as Lutherans. When I was in seminary, if you polled the student populace, what is great about Lutheranism? 9 out of 10 would say our theology. Our theology is why I'm Lutheran. We've got this great theology of grace, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Which is good. I'm not detracting from that, okay? But understand the risk of making that claim is that we're essentially saying that we know better. We've got the best thinking about Jesus, right? Is essentially the claim we're making. Which can be a valid claim, right? Grace is a really great concept, right? Because grace, ironically, is all about the idea that ultimately there's nothing that we can do that impedes our relationship with the divine, right? That ultimately there's no secret knowledge, there's no right behavior, there's nothing that we have to do for God to love us. But that in and of itself can become a crooked path, right? And if you think about Lutheranism, from when Lutheranism rises up in this country, they're Scandinavian, they're Germanic, they're Western European, which in and of itself is a crooked path, right? It's restrictive because, granted, these are groups of immigrants that are moving to an area, identifying and living with their own, worshiping with their own. But it wasn't so long ago. Even it still is today. If we look at, we did a poll of our congregation as to our ancestry. wasn't so long ago that we were still doing Scandinavian Day, and which I'm not saying there's anything fundamentally wrong with that, but understand that if being a Lutheran means being Scandinavian, it's pretty hard to become a Lutheran if you're anything other than Scandinavian, which is it's making a crooked path, right? And we're struggling with that yet today. I mean, how many times have you heard we are the whitest denomination in the U.S.? We are, right? Part of the reason that we're the whitest denomination in the U.S. is because so much of our cultural identity is tied into our religious identity. It's hard to separate those things. That's making crooked a straight path forward, right? We're not doing it necessarily intentionally, but we have to be aware that it's not just the conservative non-denominational evangelicals, that we all do this, and we can't help it. We do it one way or another. So take our creeds, right? We've got 3 of them that we use. Apostles, Nicene, Athanasian, in increasing order of length. Because each of those is a dialing into a further detail, essentially. Which when we cover early church stuff, is exactly what we're going to talk about. A colleague of mine who you may or may not have heard about, not able to ever, she had a church in Denver and wrote a lot of books, did a lot of stuff. And she had a great sermon that I listened to one time. She did a sermon on the Apostles' Creed, essentially talking about what it means that this is part of our worship, is that we make this confession of faith. It can be a tough thing, because if you walk into the church, you never experienced a liturgical Lutheran worship experience, you get done with a sermon, sing a song, and then the first thing that happens is everybody stands up and recites the same words, all that start with "I believe," right? Which can seem like it's a peer pressure to conform to a belief system, right? Like, okay, now we all say that we believe the exact same thing, right? You understand that perspective. In fact, there's been several times where we have, I don't know if you noticed, that where we've done memorial services where the family requested that we do not do the Apostles' Creed, because they knew there were going to be a lot of people there that weren't connected to a church and they felt it would be alienating, which I absolutely agree to, right? Part of me wishes I could have this nuanced conversation about what that actually means. And here's what Nadia had to say about the Apostles' Creed. She said, creeds are only communal statements. They are not individual statements. Despite the language that we have, you can only say creeds together, because it's not what I believe, it's what we believe. And it's not about all of us conforming to the same belief. The way that she talked about it is, if you go stanza by stanza through the Apostles' Creed, I believe in God the Creator, God the Father Almighty, Creator of heaven and earth. I believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of the Lord. I believe in the Holy Spirit. Right? If you go through that stanza by stanza, you will inevitably brush up against something that you struggle with. Right? One that we often bump into is, well, why does it say Catholic? Which I've educated many person on. It's small C Catholic. It means universal. Not big C Catholic. We're not referring to the denomination, but that's a different conversation. But you will brush up against stuff where you're kind of like, Jesus descended to the dead and on the 3rd day rose again. Okay, what is that about? Right? Do you understand that fully? What the original authors of the creed were making, what claim they were making about him? But when we gather communally and we make that statement of faith, the way Nadia talked about it, it's like, if you have a congregation of people, you're going to find somebody for whom that stanza means something, right? And if you go through it stanza by stanza, together we can make that faith claim. Because together, we're all going to brush up against stuff that doesn't quite vibe, or we might not understand fully, but together we can make that faith claim, right? Like, it's kind of like if you had an infinite number of monkeys, an infinite number of typewriters, eventually they produce Shakespeare, right? But it's this idea that if you put enough people of faith together in a room, eventually you can, you round out the Apostles' Creed. Everybody assents to a piece of it. And yet, the Apostles' Creed is a finite thing speaking to an infinite God. Right? And that's maybe the most important piece of that, is a creed is a faith claim that we make about the divine, and it's a finite claim, right? There are only however many, there's 3 articles, however many stanzas in that, or however many lines in that. And this is where our Eastern sisters and brothers do this a little bit better, is we can make claims, but ultimately everything outside of our claim is the mystery of the divine, right? It's the God behind the picture, right? Go.
I want to push that.
Yeah.
Say my sense is then that everything within the creedal statements is mystery.
Yes.
And we lack the awe, the sheer wonder that any of those statements is possible by human brain.
Yeah.
They're just all mind-blowing.
They're really
Crazy stuff.
arrogant. They're arrogant claims, if you think about
Incredible claim. And I think they're best understood in relationship to a dialogue with all other claims.
Yeah.
About the divine, because when they become, we have the truth and nothing but the truth.
So help us
So,
God.
and they don't. Then we're missing the point. It's like I mean, it's been about 30 years or more that I've thought Lutheranism isn't really much good by itself. It needs to be like the North. It needs to be spread among other things to make its claim at all, right? I don't see how we really improve in some ways more upon a lot of other groups, right? Certainly not isolated from those other groups.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing. Every faith community has some boundary around it in order to keep it going, in order to keep it pure enough to say, well, gosh, what in 2023, how do we understand these incredible claims, right, that we make, and how do we understand them in a way that's intelligible to talk to other people about, including our own kids.
Especially our own kids.
Including our own, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Virgin Mary. Wow. Yeah. And, we don't have discussions about that.
Do you know how many times I get by folks that are not people of faith? How many times that I get asked about the Virgin Mary?
Sure.
Right? What's that all about? That's not really a Lutheran thing. Kind of. It's complicated.
Well, and again, the history of the discussion is
Yeah.
really important.
Yeah.
Because throughout the last 2,000 years, people have had various ways of getting at that, and various ways of saying it's a priority or not so much of a priority.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, what a group does in its generation to say, well, now this is really an important claim, and we have to make sure that, right?
Because at that point in time, it might be an important claim. It has relevance to the world around them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, again, if we're tied to, James, Andrew, Peter, and John, and Paul, and Barnabas, we're tied to them. We need to be clear about how we're tied to those claims.
Yeah.
What they mean, what they've meant, and especially what we mean when we say, this is the final revelation. This is it. And the canon's closed.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And to say, well, why is it closed? Well, I maintain it's closed because it's too much for us anyway.
Yeah.
We don't digest it enough anyway.
Yeah.
So it's plenty for us.
Yeah.
But to say that Jesus is making the claim, this is the essential revelation of God to humanity. And is Jesus himself making it?
But there's an important piece in that, which is, we've talked about how so much of what we're doing is trying to draw a direct line back to Jesus, right? Back to the apostles. But that's a static thing, right? Like Jesus lived, Jesus died, Jesus was resurrected, that happened. But one of the claims that we make, it's in our third article of our creed, is that the Holy Spirit is at work in and amongst us, continuing to create. So, on the one hand, we're drawn back, but on the other hand, we're also making the claim that there is room for revelation. right? There is still room for God to do new and different things within the people, within the people of God, which throws a whole other level of complexity to this. And this is why these lines are so tough sometimes, right? Is because anybody can claim to hear a revelation from God. and so how do you check that? Well, what we do is we go back and we compare it to the original apostolic succession. Like, how does this line up with everything that's come before us? And I don't say this to figure this out. I'm just saying this is, you mentioned earlier, Paul, this is why maybe at the top of this list, we mentioned before, there needs to be curiosity and humility, right? Which is what, for me, that's what this sentence is all about, okay? On one hand, it's a warning to somebody who Paul and Barnabas see as intentionally, unintentionally, capitalizing on the concept of faith to gain personal power. But on the other hand, it's here's maybe the most important part of this one. They're the paths of the Lord, right? They're not our paths. We don't trailblaze these. We don't set up the paths. We can't gatekeep them. We can't put toll roads on them. They're ultimately the way that God relates to humanity is personally, right? And I don't mean that individually. I mean directly, right? God relates to humanity directly, and doesn't need an intermediary. Okay.
Again, we all live in communities.
Exactly. So this is that statement of a reminder of like, let's make sure we're not doing this. Let's make sure we're not throwing barriers in front of people. We've got 5 minutes left. Two things. So right after this, so Paul and Barnabas have this throwdown with Bar Jesus, and right after this, Paul and Barnabas go and they speak in a synagogue. This ties into what we're talking about. Because what's interesting about it is that they go into the synagogue, and what does Paul do? Paul tells their story to them. So Paul goes in and essentially does like a brief recap of what we think of as the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. He tells their story back to them, right? And then kind of slips Jesus in at the end. For me, that's significant because this already is a departure from what we so often think of as quote unquote evangelism, which is, again, I've got this secret knowledge, and I want to inject you with that secret knowledge. But what Paul does is Paul goes in and says, you actually already know most of this, right? I'm bringing something new to you, but it's not that new. So he tells their story to them, and then at the end he says, and we siblings of Abraham, right? Because Paul's claiming his Jewish identity here. Here's what Jesus means to us. I'm really paraphrasing here. So this is the end of chapter 13, if you want to go and read it. And what's interesting then is they leave the synagogue. Some people follow them. Some people get ticked off, right? Like you'd expect would happen. And then he goes out and almost in the same breath turns to the Gentiles and says, and you're in too. and this is really the profound thing here is that he doesn't necessarily do the same thing that he did in the synagogue. In other words, he doesn't go on and talk about Zeus and Hera and their pantheon and stuff like this. But the significant thing here is that Paul is in the same scene able to find common ground with one group of people and find common ground with another group of people, and that common ground is their access to Christ. And this for me is again goes back to this is what's different, right? Is when we say I have unique knowledge about God, let me tell you what God wants. And in order for you to access God, you've got to replicate that understanding. Versus what Paul's doing here, which is, believe it or not, you already actually have a relationship with the divine. God is already in a relationship with you. Let me reveal to you how that's happening, or what, and my language is failing me here. Does that make? Do you understand that contrast?
Very much. I mean, when you think of European, settler colonialism of this continent,
Yeah.
What do we say? The exact opposite.
Yeah.
Right? You folks don't know anything about.
You're ignorant savages.
Right.
Let us enlighten you.
We have
Anytime
all
you-
the truth.
Anytime you hear enlighten,
Right. And we have all the military power.
and we have to back up our force.
Right?
Yeah.
And even when you're already Christians, we'll take half of Mexico from you.
Yeah. Because you're not the right kind of Christian.
Exactly. You're not a wow.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a terrible history.
Yeah.
We haven't been great witnesses to this.
Okay. Last thing. Okay. Well, first thing is, so next week we're going to kind of. Well, I don't know. We'll see. I always say we're going to hop through these quickly. But next week, what we're essentially going to do is we're going to do a quick survey of, so where do these other deeds go? So we can talk about that, right? So I've got a paragraph on each of them. It's interesting. I think we'll be done with that in 2 weeks. However, next week is Labor Day. Do you want to do adult ed on Labor Day, or do you want to wait until the following week? I mean, are you guys all going to be here on Labor Day?
I will not be here for several weeks.
We'll be here. Let's just do it instead of on off. I'm back. Let's stick with it. I'm going to be here. So next week, and then plan is we'll wrap this part of it up on the 12th, 11th, 10th, whatever the second week in September is. Okay. So here's the last thing. After all the stuff we're talking about, a metaphor that I've always found interesting is cover bands. Right? So any of y'all what was the music that you were listening to when you were 16 and you were able to get the record player down in your basement and the parents couldn't hear what you're listening to, right? We call it classic rock now, but yeah, whatever it was. Okay, so I worked at a music venue for years. A lot of the bands that we booked were actually cover bands. In fact, there was a really important one called Pink Droid. They were a Pink Floyd cover band. And they were really, really good, like extremely good. Okay, and their goal was to be as close to the original Pink Floyd as possible. Okay, well, just to sound exactly like David Gilmour and Roger Waters, et cetera, et cetera. And they did a really good job of it, which is why they were popular. Okay, and they also had they all worked at cover bands, however, are not the original. They will never be, right? Because they're not the original people who wrote and performed the music, okay? But they're doing their best to do a version of it. And some of them will try to do it closer to the original. Some of them will take interpretive license with it, okay? But the further out you get, the more that the group performing it influences what the music is like, right? It might carry with it an essence of that original inspiration, but, and it's not just cover bands. I mean, this is when we talk about genres of music in general. Like Black Sabbath is the origin of heavy metal. That what is qualified as heavy metal today doesn't sound a lot like Black Sabbath, but it's kind of how Jesus works. Believe it or not, it's like we have that original human being that walked the earth and died, and that story. And then we have the original cover band, which is the 12, right? Who were in the band with Jesus, but when the lead singer dies, you kind of got to reinvent yourselves. So they do, right? They reinvent themselves. And then there's a fight because Peter's the lead singer, and then Paul comes up, and Paul's a better singer. I'm stretching the metaphor, okay? But every successive generation after that, you're losing more of what that original thing is, and it's more about you, right? What this latest generation of people is bringing into that music. We're 2 millennia separated, okay? Right? Maybe we, again, really stretching this metaphor. A lot of us think that we've discovered lost recordings of Jesus, right? We can go back and get a new perspective on the original music of Jesus. But in reality, we've got a little bit of Jesus in a lot of us. A lot of us, a lot of our culture, a lot of our generation, a lot of our world, which is so much different than the world that they lived in. Keep that in mind. Keep that in mind with everything, is how much of it is us and how much of it is Jesus. and that ultimately what we're tasked with doing is providing access, or not even providing, getting out of the way of access to Jesus, right? We're telling people that there is access, and then we're getting out of the way. You know, you should go back and listen to the original recording. It's great stuff. You know. All right. See you in worship.
Everybody, just leave tables and chairs. I'll take care of it tomorrow. Okay.
It's also Linda's favorite.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.